Thank you, Alicia. Hello, everybody. I'm Debbie Fox with the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and I'm a part of the DV and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium with Collaborative Solutions, the National Alliance for Safe Housing, and the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our HUD NOFA webinar series starting today on July 18th, 2018 with NASH, NRCDV, and the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. We will provide you all with an overview of the current HUD NOFA continuum of care application process. On today's webinar, you'll be hearing from Christy Beavis from NRCDV, Peg Haskell from NASH, Brittany Manzo from USICH, and myself from the National Network to End Domestic Violence. So the goal of today's webinar is to introduce you all to the DV and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium and the work that we're doing here, and to increase your knowledge and to give you all information about the new fiscal year 2018 HUD NOFA and the NOFA application process. We're going to provide an overview of the core components. There's 3 components for the new DV bonus project for the $50 million for the Rapid Rehousing set aside for survivors. We'll be giving you a refresher course on the joint component model, the transitional housing rapid rehousing model, and discuss key considerations for domestic and sexual violence programs for both of these housing models. We're going to highlight the new opportunities and changes in the NOFA that could impact us all as DVSA providers in the application. And I also just want to give a shout out that for those of you who've read through the NOFA and are looking at it, and you probably noticed that there is a significant increase in information and prioritization around domestic and sexual violence survivors with the $50 million for the rapid rehousing set aside. So we're really happy with those changes, and we just want to thank the field and our membership for doing a lot of work and doing advocacy to help us get those additional funds. We will discuss also a bit about how you all as DVSA providers can engage and coordinate with your COCs and your balance of state to increase access for DV survivors and to work in coordination with them to apply for this funding. And I think without further ado, I'll pass it on. Oh, we'll do a little overview of the DV and the Housing Technical Assistance Consortium. So first of all, just so people know, the federal partners on the consortium, they include a combination of federal agencies. It's a very unique and innovative partnership that all these different federal agencies came together to address issues around the intersection of domestic violence and homelessness. So we work closely with the Family Violence Prevention and Services Program at HHS, which a lot of you know is where the FIPSA shelter money comes from. We also work closely with the Department of Justice, the Office on Violence Against Women, the Office for Victims of Crime, VOCA, at the Department of Justice, the Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, the SNAP's office at HUD, who are the grantees of the HUD NOFA funding that we'll be talking about today. And then we also work closely with the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, and Brittany Manzo is represented from that organization today on our webinar. And like I said in the introduction, there's 4 technical assistance providers as a part of this project, and that includes the National Alliance for Safe Housing, the Collaborative Solutions Incorporated. They are HUD technical assistance provider that's very key on our project as well, and then myself with the National Network to End Domestic Violence and the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. And I just wanted to give you all the infographic as well for the website. The Safe Housing Partnerships website is the hub. It's the place, the online place, the portal that you all can go to and visit at any time to get resources about the DV Housing Consortium, and we will have this webinar will be uploaded to that website. We have a lot of graphics and data and literature and best practices and the cutting edge research in the field around DV and housing and homelessness is also on that website. So please visit it to get more information and more resources. And now I will turn it over to Brittany Manzo from USICH.
Thanks, Debbie. Good morning, everyone on the West Coast, because we never go West Coast first. Good afternoon to everyone who's not on the West Coast. My name is Brittany Manzo, and I'm a policy advisor at the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. I'm going to walk us through a very quick overview of our federal partnership in the work to end homelessness, And then I'll move into an overview of the Continuum of Care program and the specifics of this year's funding competition and bonus funding. I'll wrap up with an overview of opportunities for partnership between domestic violence service providers and COCs to strengthen connections to housing for survivors of domestic violence who are experiencing homelessness using this year's competition. I'll then turn it back over to Debbie with NNEDV and our partners at the Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium. So as you saw on that last slide, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness is an independent federal agency tasked with coordinating the federal response to homelessness and tasked with creating national partnership at every level of government and with the private sector to reduce and end homelessness nationwide, while also working to maximize the effectiveness of the federal government in contributing to the work to end homelessness. You can see our list of federal partners here on the right. Our federal partnership demonstrates and mimics the whole of system and whole of community approach we'll need in order to prevent and end homelessness, ensuring homelessness is a rare, brief, and non-recurring experience for individuals and families across the country. Our work together is guided by a shared federal strategic plan to prevent and end homelessness. Our partners in HUD's Office of Community Planning and Development play a key role in advancing our work to meet the goals that are outlined in that federal strategic plan. The Continuum of Care program, which is under that office in HUD, is the key structure that HUD uses to advance community partnership and commitment in the work to end homelessness. To do this, HUD provides funding through the competition using the COC structure for efforts to support efforts by nonprofit providers and state and local governments to quickly rehouse homeless individuals and families while minimizing the trauma and dislocation caused to them during their experience of homelessness. In addition to funding housing programs, COCs also use coordinated entry processes to promote access to and effective utilization of programs and resources that are available in the community for, but not necessarily targeted to, individuals and families experiencing homelessness. So in addition to funding a lot of the programs serving our neighbors experiencing homelessness, the COC program is also intended to organize and lead our local efforts to end homelessness. There are more than 400 continuums of care covering the entire country, as many of you already know, I'm sure. Some of those COCs encompass a city, while others encompass a whole state or a large part of a rural state. But in every community, the COC serves as the local governance structure for homeless services programs. Their key functions are to manage COC membership and partnerships, apply for and disperse federal funding, monitor and evaluate grantees' performance, establish written standards for providing assistance, manage data and performance standards, and arguably, most importantly, provide access to housing and other resources and services through coordinated entry. COCs are really the hub for collaboration across housing and service providers that work with individuals and families experiencing homelessness in a community. COCs are therefore really well positioned to broker and foster relationships and collaboration across our systems. So before we get into this year's funding competition for housing resources, and I want to really emphasize that the funding competition isn't just for housing resources, it's also to fund the data that drives a lot of our understanding of homelessness across the country, and the funding can also be used for coordinated entry as well. So before we get into all of those details, I want to walk through opportunities that you as domestic violence and sexual assault providers can pursue to establish or strengthen your partnerships with your local COC. USICH has worked closely with our federal partners and the Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium to promote partnerships between your two systems over the last several years. So I want to make sure we don't just get caught up in funding opportunities, but that we're also working in a broader context of strengthening our partnerships to ensure that everyone experiencing homelessness has connection to the housing and services they need to regain stability. So some of the opportunities listed here may feel pie in the sky to you, or maybe you're already doing some of this. But I want to walk through some of these opportunities with you so they're in the back of your mind as you undertake the work with your partners and COCs. So as a baseline in partnership at the local level, I think ensuring that you have pathways for referrals to and from COCs and the resources that they have available is really critical to ensuring that survivors of domestic violence, no matter the point at which they're identified in our communities, have access to both the housing and the services that they need. You may already be doing this through coordinated entry, or you may be working on the challenges of data sharing to make coordinated entry participation possible. But I just wanted to do a little editorializing and encourage you to stick with it and commit to developing a process that works for your community. I know the TA Consortium is here to help too if you'd like a hand in that work. Another key strategy is to ensure that your community has a sense of the needs of survivors of domestic violence who are experiencing homelessness and the unmet need in your community. The first way to do this is to share de-identified aggregate data with your COC and to participate in point-in-time counts of people experiencing homelessness. This is a really big point this year in the context of the competition too. HUD really wants to see that COCs have a strong sense of unmet needs. So the more you can help your COC understand unmet needs, the better poised you'll be to receive funding for programs and strengthen that cross-system partnership. So two last points here. I just want to encourage a couple of really specific strategies. One is two-way board membership. Participate in your COC governance processes, whether you're invited to, whether you reach out to seek opportunities, and then identify whether there are opportunities to bring them in to participate in some of the boards for your programs. It may be a stepping stone along the way, but sharing training resources is also a great way to demonstrate what your two systems and different types of programs have to add to each other, and really just kind of trigger some of that thinking around what can we do, what can we bring to each other's boards and to each other's staff as we think about our partnerships. Okay, so I am going to move on to what you're all here for, the 2018 COC Program Competition itself. You'll hear us throughout the webinar referring to the NOFA. The NOFA is the Notice of Funding Availability. It's a vehicle through which HUD communicates its priorities for funding, and it serves as a mechanism for COCs to prioritize and rank programs for funding. I think it's helpful here to note that HUD leverages the NOFA to encourage best practices, to encourage partnership, and encourage improvements in system performance. That's a big piece of what COCs look for when the NOFA is released, and I'm sure many of you as well. You're reading through to see what's new, what priorities are for this year, or what best practices are being emphasized. So this is, again, a competitive process. So the degree to which communities are already implementing best practices or working to improve system performance is really important. So this year, approximately $2.1 billion in funding is available. COC's applications will be scored based on the scoring criteria outlined in the NOFA. HUD assigns points to different categories of work. Those categories this year are everything from coordination and engagement, project capacity, system performance, strategic planning. It's all in the NOFA. If you want to flip through there to check out the breakdown, the points allocated for each of those categories are then again broken down by really specific topics and best practices. So HUD's really clear about what they hope to see communities doing. If you're interested in that specific breakdown, I'm going to point you to the webinar that USICH did last week on the NOFA, where we really walk through the scoring highlights. I'll drop a link to that webinar in the chat box after my presentation. One quick note, a logistics note, is that the application deadline is September 18th this year. Your local deadlines will be at least 30 days prior to that. Okay. So again, I'm not going to walk through those scoring categories blow by blow today, since that scoring is what happens at the level of the COC application, not at individual project applications. If you're interested, again, in that degree of detail, check out USICH's webinar and resources that are available through HUD. I'll share a couple of links when I'm done. But all of the scoring priorities that I'm referring to in the NOFA are underpinned by HUD's policy priorities and the Federal Strategic Plan to Prevent and End Homelessness. So the policy priorities that HUD outlined this year are the same four as last year. The key priorities are ending homelessness for all people, creating a systemic response to homelessness, strategically allocating and using resources, and using a housing-first approach. So everything that's scored or encouraged to be a local priority in this NOFA is connected to one of those 4 policy priorities and the vision of the federal strategic plan. When it comes to project level applications, it's important to note that your COC will rank project applications in order of priority for the community, and they'll be ranked in 2 tiers. Again, all of this is happening in the context of those policy priorities. Projects ranked in Tier 1 will be the community's top priority projects, and the amount of funding they get for those projects will depend on how their project application matches up with those scoring categories mentioned earlier. Funding for projects ranked in Tier 2 will depend on the COC's overall score, project's own ranking, and the degree to which projects in Tier 2 are implementing housing first practices. Again, that level of detail is covered in our webinar from last week if you're interested in the granularity of it. COC's processes, though, to determine project ranking should be based on project performance and local needs. And that's the place where it's really important that your COC partners understand not only the scope of unmet needs of survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault in your community, but also know that you have a strong understanding of needs, that you can offer them data to demonstrate that need to HUD. That's emphasized throughout the NOFA this year, so something I just really want to drive home with you all. So as in previous years, the following project types are eligible for funding: rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, joint transitional rapid rehousing component projects, which we've been shorthanding to joint component projects, coordinated entry projects, which are categorized as supportive services only projects, and projects for HMIS and comparable databases. I just want to note here that transitional housing projects can only be funded through renewal funding. In other words, COCs can't fund new transitional housing projects through the competition. There are some significant changes to this year's competition, new opportunities that I really want to highlight for you all. HUD has created an opportunity for providers to consolidate projects, to take 2 or more projects of the same type and consolidate them into one grant to reduce and streamline administrative work for the provider. Another potentially bigger opportunity in this year's NOFA is the opportunity to transition your projects from one project type to another. This is really great news for providers who are interested in moving from one project type to another, maybe from a lower performing project type to a project type that better meets the needs of folks in your community. So if you've been looking at your project and your performance and the way that your project is working in your community and thinking that maybe a joint component model would be better suited to needs in your community where folks can come in and either go straight into rapid rehousing or to go into more of a transitional housing setting until they decide they're ready to transition to rapid rehousing, or even transition a transitional housing project to rapid rehousing. So through transition grants, providers can use up to 50% of their grant under the original housing model. So that means that your clients will be able to transition along with your project. And here HUD is really responding to concerns that they've heard from providers over time. So this is a new opportunity really tailored to needs that HUD has identified. Also, I wanted to talk a little bit about bonus projects. It's important to note that we used to see a bonus funding opportunity exclusive to permanent supportive housing projects to meet the needs necessary to end chronic homelessness, and that opportunity has now been expanded. So in addition to the renewal projects outlined in this slide, in the previous slide, I'm sorry, communities can apply for bonuses to create new projects for permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, joint component projects, HMIS, and coordinated entry. So this is really an opportunity to create more or new projects in your community that we had previously only been able to do for the most part through reallocation. So talk to your COCs about these opportunities. The project types, particularly in the expanded bonus projects, are limited to specific population eligibility to encourage flow to permanent housing in your community. So there are some particular details that you'll need to work through with your COC before deciding to propose and apply for a new project. Now last, but certainly not least for this crowd, is the new opportunity for bonus projects serving survivors of domestic violence. Before I get into the nitty-gritty, I just want to note that while this is a separate pot of funding, projects targeted to serving survivors are also eligible for the other pot of bonus funds that I mentioned as well. So, so don't feel like it's necessarily an either or here. So as I'm sure many of you have heard, $50 million has been allocated for new projects targeted to serving survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and human trafficking. One really important thing to note, and I think important to frame your understanding of what's possible through this bonus, is that these bonus funds can only fund projects that aren't already receiving COC funds. So if your project is already funded through the COC in part, you'll want to apply for that separate pot, that other kind of expanded pot of bonus funding. But if you aren't already receiving COC funds, this is a really great opportunity to expand your community's capacity to serve survivors of domestic violence who are experiencing homelessness. So eligible project types for these bonus funds are rapid rehousing, joint component projects, and coordinated entry projects. So these, each COC can apply for up to 3 bonus projects in your community. That's one of each type. The projects must have a housing first orientation, and projects that are, this is a pretty important note as well. If you have projects in your community that aren't dedicated to serving survivors, you can use this bonus funding to expand dedicated beds, dedicated units, or expand the number of people served through coordinated entry. So you can kind of have an expansion project as a proposal here as well. So unlike other bonus funding opportunities of the past, these bonus projects must be ranked by your COC. So when you come in to talk to your COC about including this project application or a new project for survivors in your Continuum of Cares application, they're going to need to rank it along with all other projects. So HUD has designed this bonus project opportunity to encourage partnership between domestic violence service providers and COCs. So the purpose of needing to rank your bonus project here is to really ensure that you and COC leadership, recognizing that they may be one and the same, but that domestic violence service providers and COC leadership have a shared understanding of the need, the unmet needs for survivors in your community, and that they're ranking that new project accordingly. They're prioritizing that project based on a deep understanding of unmet needs. So if a COC's project serving survivors, if a bonus project is not selected for this pot of funding, since that project's ranked, it will remain on the COC's priority listing and will be eligible for funding through that other pot, through the kind of expanded bonus projects that I mentioned earlier. So again, I'm going to say that a little bit clearer this time. If a COC's bonus project serving survivors is not selected for this pot of bonus funding, again, HUD only has up to $50 million available for this, so at some point they won't be able to fund everything. The DV bonus project will remain on the COC's priority listing, and it will be eligible for funding as bonus projects through the COC program. So when you're approaching your Continuum of Care partners about this opportunity, keep in mind that HUD is really focused here on integration with the broader system. They've put safety and trauma-informed services for people participating in programs at the forefront of what they're looking for in the design of your projects. They're looking for housing first implementation as well. But really underpinning all this is the focus on integration. So we really encourage you to work closely with your COC partners to identify opportunities to build new projects using this bonus opportunity. So I want to end here with a bit of a checklist. This slide is kind of a summary of opportunities that are in the NOFA that can be leveraged to strengthen COC's partnerships with domestic violence service providers. So this is a list of opportunities to explore with your COC. Here at the top, something we haven't mentioned yet is that as with last year's NOFA, there are points in the COC application for the COC to demonstrate how well they can meet the needs of victims of domestic violence. So work hand in hand with your COC so they know exactly what you all are capable of and doing in your community so that they get full points on the application for the community's ability to meet the needs of survivors. And if your work has room for improvement, take this as an opportunity to outline how you're going to improve that. Again, coordinated entry referrals and participation is a huge opportunity to strengthen your community's ability to meet needs. Implementing housing first practices is a real key in what we know works to end homelessness. So the more your programs are implementing housing first, the better suited your communities are to expand the funding that they're able to get. And the other opportunities outlined here we've talked through already. Kind of are there opportunities to create joint component projects for survivors or bonus projects serving survivors of domestic violence. So again, this is intended to be a bit of a checklist of what can we do together, prompted a bit by the COC competition. So the last slide I have here is just some additional resources. USICH.gov has several resources on partnerships between domestic violence service providers and COCs. Of course, there's safehousingpartnerships.org for you to get hands-on technical assistance. The National Alliance to End Homelessness has some critical resources, and my information is there as well if you have any questions or want to clarify anything I've shared. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Debbie. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Britt, for the overview of the HUD NOFA and the HUD NOFA process. So I just wanted to go a little bit more in depth about the fiscal year 18 NOFA around the key definitions and concepts in the NOFA. And just a quick overview, you can find me, that's my email, dfox@nadv.org if you want to email me questions, and you can also find me on Twitter. And then a little bit about NADV. We're the membership organization for all the state coalitions around the country and the territories and the allied organizations connected to those state coalitions. So just a little bit more about the DV Bonus Project. It's a project dedicated to survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or human trafficking as defined in the statute there. So the funds for this, the DV Bonus Project, are to serve 100% survivors of domestic or sexual violence. It could include organizations that are not primary purpose victim service providers. DV victim service providers are strongly encouraged to apply for these funds as we advocated for these funds at the federal level with our Housing Consortium partners and with our membership. We definitely had a vision that we would encourage and love for the victim service providers to apply for these funds and take the lead and be able to provide the housing and coordinated entry services for survivors. That being said, if you are working in your local community or with your balance of state and your partners in the homelessness system that are part of your continuum of care are applying for the funds and will be taking the lead on receiving this funding, potential funding, we do encourage you to partner closely with your homeless service providers to provide these services to victims. And just to clarify, there was some talk in the chat box about applying for the new, the bonus project. So you can apply for up to 3. You could apply for one of any of these projects, or you could apply for all 3 of the DV bonus projects, and that can be either the joint component project, which Peg will talk about a little bit more. I see some chat about that model in the chat box, but that's a combination of rapid rehousing and transitional housing. You can also apply for DV rapid rehousing, and also there's the supportive services category of coordinated entry. So you can apply for up to all 3. So in the NOFA, you will see that there are limitations on the amount of funding for the DV bonus, and there's a you can apply, the COC can apply for up to 10% of its preliminary pro rata need from or a minimum of $50,000 or a maximum of $5 million. Before I confuse you all, this is not anything that you all have to start getting your calculators out and worry about, but your continuums of care will know the amounts that they're eligible to apply for. So when you talk to them or reach out to them, they'll be able to give you a figure of what that amount will look like that you can apply for. So like I said, you can create up to 3 projects, and then if you look on page 8 in sections 2B and 2B10E of the NOFA, you'll see the application requirements and how the DV bonus projects will be reviewed and selected. And at the end of the webinar, we'll have a link to the HUD NOFA as well, and you can Google it now and pull it up if you want to take a look at it. So just to clarify, the eligibility around this funding and around HUD funding is domestic and sexual violence survivors are eligible for HUD Continuum of Care funds that are related to violence against the individual or family member, including a child. And sometimes we hear interpretations in the field, but you can be housed and attempting to flee domestic violence and be eligible for these funds, current HUD funds or the new DV bonus project Continuum of Care funds. So when you're thinking about designing your programs and eligibility in your local communities, if a survivor is currently hospice fleeing, they are eligible. They don't have to be literally homeless to get these funds. And so the fleer attempting to flee domestic violence it either takes place within the individual family's primary nighttime residence, or has made the individual family afraid to return to their home or residence, and the individual has no other residence or resources, or the individual family lacks the resources or support networks to get other housing resources. And just a quick note, there has been an update in this year's HUD NOFA that HUD has clarified that persons who are fleeing or attempting to flee human trafficking do also qualify as homeless under Category 4 of the homeless definition at 24 CFR. So HUD considers human trafficking, including sex trafficking, to be another dangerous or life-threatening condition that relates to violence against the individual or family member. And also to be of note, another update and change to this year's HUD NOFA is there is a prioritization around racial disparities, and there's been a lot of work that's been happening on the national and local level in terms of research and stuff we know in the field, but there's research that does address racial disparities and the disproportionality that specifically Black and Native Americans have experienced homelessness at a higher rate. And so when we're looking at this work, we definitely want to take an intersectional approach and also thinking about racial disparities in terms of a gender lens as well. And when we think about Matthew Desmond's work in Evicted around how African American women are evicted at much higher rates than other populations. So when you're looking at efforts to prevent and end homelessness in your HUD NOFA application and are looking at outcomes and the needs in your community, you should definitely consider and address racial inequities to achieve positive outcomes for all persons experiencing homelessness. And if you want more information about research that's happening in the field, you should look for Spark's work. There's a link there that they're supporting partnerships for anti-racist communities at the Centers for Social Innovation. You could look at their research that came out in the past year that highlights the disproportionality for communities of color. And then also USICH is working and leading the way on addressing and having strategies for addressing racial disparities, and you can click on the link there. It's also important to note that there are compliance with Violence Against Women Act, the housing protections for VAWA if you are applying for Continuum of Care funds. So for those of you who are, oh, the slides are doing something. Sorry about that. So when you apply for these funds, and if you're awarded these funds, to be in compliance with the VAWA final rule, you must establish emergency transfer plans and make transfer plans happen for survivors. So what that looks like if someone is housed in a Continuum of Care program and they are experiencing domestic violence or they are in danger, they can request a transfer to be able to move to a safe location. And so this is something that the DV and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium is working on closely with HUD and with our partners at the National Housing Law Project. So there are timelines and part of your grant agreements that you would need to meet this criteria, and we can help you come up with emergency transfer plans and policies to be in compliance. And so I'm going to turn it over to Peg, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about the programmatic elements of the DV bonus project and hopefully can answer some of the questions that have been in the chat box. All yours, Peg.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Peg Haskalow. I'm the CEO of the National Alliance for Safe Housing. I won't go in depth about NASH. You can find more information about us at the Safe Housing Partnership's website. But I do want to stress that NASH is a project of a local program in DC, the District Alliance for Safe Housing. So much of our information is being informed by our services locally. So I wanted to talk to you all a little bit about just program elements around the two different kinds of projects that we're talking about today. The first being joint component projects. So HUD first introduced these projects in last year's competition and is making them available again this year through the DV bonus. Joint component projects are designed to be a bridge between temporary housing and permanent housing. So they're really aimed at offering survivors and other individuals and families who have really significant barriers to achieving permanent housing. It's designed to offer those folks safe short-term housing and services and then really swiftly connect them to permanent housing options while maintaining provision of services. So these programs are aimed at people who need additional help to get into both crisis housing or transitional housing before they're able to move into permanent housing. So in that respect, joint component projects are designed really to better serve homeless individuals and families who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, but are best for communities that have a large number of people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness, maybe have a lack of crisis housing capacity to shelter everyone who are experiencing homelessness, and possibly a lack of strategies to exit people into permanent housing quickly. So they're really aimed at getting people off the streets, getting them into housing, and then connecting them to permanent housing quickly. They're not really best suited for communities where there's just a scarcity of permanent housing options that might result in overlong stays in shelter or transitional housing. In joint component projects, both types of housing have to be offered, both transitional housing as well as rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing have to be offered within those project types. And it's up to the communities that apply to decide how much of each type of housing to offer. So it really should be enough rapid rehousing to ensure that at any given time a survivor can move from transitional housing to permanent housing. And keep in mind that survivors in this project type aren't required to enter transitional housing before they go into rapid rehousing. So in the current FY18 NOFA, the way that they have suggested that this can be designed is to demonstrate, either through your budget that there's twice as many resources for the rapid rehousing portion as the transitional housing portion, or by having twice as many permanent housing or rapid rehousing units at any point in time as the transitional housing units, or by demonstrating that the budget and the units are appropriate for the population being served. But you get the idea that what is being requested is that you have at least as much rapid rehousing for the participants in this program as those that are going into transitional housing, and likely more. So joint component projects should really speak to how they're going to assist participants to move into permanent housing of their choice, and that move is based on their strengths and needs and preferences and resources. So your local COC can't dictate the minimum stay in either portion of the project, whether, so they can't say that it has to be a certain amount of transitional housing, for the project, or a certain amount of rapid rehousing. That you need to be able to describe that survivors would receive, the type of assistance that they need to safely and stably exit homelessness and then get into permanent housing. So not all program participants would automatically receive 24 months of assistance. It's just that it's a 24-month maximum length of stay between both transitional housing and rapid rehousing. And the COC is going to have to develop written standards for prioritizing this kind of assistance locally, and then the recipients or subrecipients would be required to follow those written standards. So that's, in a nutshell, what joint component projects are designed to look like. The domestic violence rapid rehousing projects are a little different. So my first bullet has a typo, but what we're saying is that domestic violence rapid rehousing can be a particularly good strategy for survivors who have relative safety from abuse, but who need permanent housing. So they may not need to exit into crisis or transitional housing, but who are able to move directly into rapid rehousing or permanent housing from their situations. And that they need access to stable and sustainable permanent housing that, has been demonstrated in studies now to produce longer-term safety and well-being for survivors. So it's an approach that has been validated through research and is now being recommended. DV rapid rehousing is good for survivors who don't need temporary housing and who can establish safety and stability in the community, and therefore is as different from joint component projects, is recommended for communities who may have a scarcity of permanent housing options that results in overlong stays in shelter. So that's where domestic violence rapid rehousing projects are a recommended option. Domestic violence rapid rehousing looks similar to other mainstream homeless rapid rehousing programs, but it has a few specific modifications, and I just lost my connection to my slide. Thanks, whoever changed that back. So, the differences are going to be that there may be longer or tailored rental subsidies to survivors that are in DV rapid rehousing projects to ensure that they have housing stability for the long term. So whereas many mainstream rapid rehousing projects might have short, 6-month or 4-month or, even 12-month housing subsidies, DV rapid rehousing subsidies might be longer, but they would be specifically tailored to the survivor's needs up to 24 months. Support for survivors with identifying housing options in the community is going to be really important to both help survivors overcome barriers to achieving permanent housing. We know that a lot of survivors face specific barriers due to their status as victims of domestic or sexual violence, and it's important to have advocacy so that they can identify housing that is going to be safe for them and where they're going to be able to achieve stability. Some survivors need access to flexible funding to help them maintain housing stability. So emergency financial support to help them overcome financial hurdles so that they can maintain their ongoing housing. And then consistent and comprehensive safety planning. When survivors move into DV rapid rehousing, it doesn't necessarily mean that their safety is not still an issue. And so they need ongoing support to help them safety plan and think about how they're going to maintain their safety and that of their family and ultimately achieve stability for themselves. And finally, that they have supportive and voluntary services for the duration of the program, that they aren't simply, provided housing and then cut off from services, and that they have confidentiality in their data and all of the services that they receive. So DV Rapid Rehousing does look a little different. It is a little bit more involved and certainly aimed to support survivors' long-term safety and stability. DV Rapid Rehousing programs under the bonus are designed to serve only survivors of domestic violence, and as we said before, sexual assault, stalking, dating violence, and human trafficking, but we're sort of broadly using domestic violence to describe those survivors and their families. And that while these projects are part of the community's continuum of care, the rapid rehousing projects that are funded under the bonus will employ a comparable database and use confidentiality for survivors' information. So whether, depending on how your COC has set it up, if there's a comparable database for your program to be able to collect aggregate, de-identified information about participants in your DV Rapid Rehousing project, however it is that your COC has arranged to do that, that's what would be used for DV Rapid Rehousing projects under the bonus. Survivors that are served through DV Rapid Rehousing should also have access to services through the broader continuum of care and coordinated entry systems. So it's not just that survivors of domestic violence are served through this one project. They should also have access to your broader continuum of care in case they need entry into other types of services or programs that are offered there. And both Joint Component Project and Domestic Violence Rapid Rehousing projects would be eligible for continuation funding in future years if they're funded under the bonus. So once they're funded here, then they would be eligible for continuation funding next year and the years after. Finally, some other considerations that we just wanted to bring to your attention. There is an expectation of housing first. Britt Manzo touched on this earlier. What that means in the context of these projects is that they should operate with low barriers to entry to accommodate survivors who have different needs. They should be able to work quickly to move people into permanent housing. They would not require participation in supportive services, so it's obviously a voluntary services approach. And for transitional housing projects, they don't require any preconditions for moving into transitional housing. So again, a low barrier project. Other elements around Housing First are that, service and housing plans are survivor-driven and really emphasize how survivor choice is integrated into the safety and housing needs. So we really are, interested in making sure that projects are responding to survivors' needs and that survivors are central to the kinds of decisions around the services that they access or how their needs are responded to in their service and housing plans. Service options can range from crisis and emergency support to long-term stability, so it's really, again, going to depend on the survivor's needs. But they should have choice in terms of the extent and the nature of supports that are offered, and flexibility, both in terms of lengths of stay, how long they would stay in transitional housing if it's the Joint Component Project or Rapid Rehousing otherwise, but that it's really going to be based on the survivors' needs and what their preferences are. and that they have the ability to exit to the permanent housing of their choice with increased safety and security. One of the approaches that we really love to talk about is the domestic violence housing first approach. And this was an approach that has been developed by the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And they have essentially taken the standard housing first model and modified it to be good for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And so we think that it's well suited for joint component projects and domestic violence rapid rehousing programs. And what that might look like is, that programs are survivor informed, trauma informed, and that they provide mobile advocacy to survivors wherever they are in the community in a way that's safe and convenient for survivors. So really bringing the services to them where they are in a way that is safe and works for them. That there's flexible funding that can be used to support housing access and stability that isn't necessarily limited to rental subsidies or one-time grants. And I referred to this a little earlier, the idea being that survivors might need support through emergency financial assistance to help them overcome financial barriers so that they can maintain safe and stable housing, and that's a central element of DV Housing First. And also that community engagement and partnerships with a wide range of housing providers, including landlords, really help increase access for survivors and supports broader systems change. So being able to connect survivors to the services that they need in the community, be that housing, helping to broker relationships for them with landlords, helping them to lease up, helping them to address housing issues in their transitional or permanent housing, as well as helping to connect them to other kinds of community services is important in a DV Housing First approach. And you can go to this link to get more information specifically about DV Housing First. And then finally, some other best practices, safety planning, wraparound services along with housing. I've touched on that, connection to community services, flexible funding, and systems advocacy. So again, we're really looking broadly at what survivors' needs are and how to help them address their safety and stability in the community. Applicants for a few final considerations. Applicants for the joint components projects or domestic violence rapid rehousing projects don't have to be domestic violence programs. So these projects can be funded by non-domestic violence programs. However, it's strongly advised that non-domestic violence providers partner with DV programs to ensure critical program elements are included, such as safety planning and confidentiality and trauma-informed services and survivor choice. Because we know that domestic violence programs have that expertise, we really want to see them offer that expertise to these kinds of projects. Also, joint component projects and DV rapid rehousing projects are parts of a continuum of care's coordinated entry system. So COCs should have developed written standards that outline prioritization policies for their community that's inclusive of individuals and families who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. So, again, and I think Britt really touched on this earlier, we're looking for partnerships between domestic violence programs and COCs such that survivors have access to safe housing throughout the continuum as well as within these projects. COCs can choose to prioritize a certain vulnerability factor over another. This is really based on the COC's overall strategy to end homelessness. And that prioritization would allow or can allow survivors to be placed at a higher priority for the next available or appropriate resource. So we know that it is up to COCs to prioritize projects like joint component projects or domestic violence rapid rehousing projects for their continuums. But of course, they should be working in tandem with domestic violence programs. And given that some communities lost funding for transitional housing for survivors over the last few years, it's important in the process of developing these new programs to demonstrate the number of survivors who aren't connecting to permanent housing and really be able to show how the Joint Component Project or the Domestic Violence Rapid Rehousing Project is part of the COC's comprehensive strategy to end homelessness. So again, working in tandem to end homelessness and ensure that survivors have access to safe housing is essential. And that's all I have to offer, and I'm going to turn it over to Christy now.
Thanks, Peg. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Christy Beavis, and I'm with the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. And before I jump into my portion of the presentation, there is one thing we wanted to clarify. We've had some really great questions coming through the chat, but we just wanted to be sure we were providing comprehensive information about project submissions for the DV bonus. So just to quickly recap, if you are interested in submitting a project application, you know it goes to the COC, and then through the COC collaborative applicant, they will submit a comprehensive application with all of the project submissions to HUD. So with the DV bonus project, there are three main components as we've discussed. We want to encourage as many projects to submit applications for the DV bonus, but understanding that for each of the three core areas, that would be DV Rapid Rehousing, the Joint Component Project, and also for support services for coordinated entry, one application for each of those core components will be submitted. So it won't necessarily be that if, so let me back that up. If there's 10 DV Rapid Rehousing projects that are submitted for the DV bonus, the best project out of that will be the one selected and submitted with the COC application. So I hope that helps provide some clarification. Again, we've had some really great questions, and we just want to make sure y'all were getting all of the information that you needed, and we certainly can provide additional clarification at the end of the webinar. So on to my portion of the webinar. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about coordinated entry. And while the majority of this webinar has focused on the DV bonus, particularly on the rapid rehousing and the joint component project, we also want to highlight the opportunity to apply for supportive services only coordinated entry under the DV bonus. So what is it? What is a supportive service only coordinated entry project? Well, it really is designed to offer COCs the opportunity to implement policies, procedures, and practices that better equip the COC to meet the needs of survivors, and whether that's domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. So again, for example, if a COC was really interested in how to implement stronger policies and procedures that are trauma-informed or client-centered, you could apply for the SSOSEE project. Or if a COC wanted to improve coordination referrals between the COC's coordinated entry and the victim service provider's coordinated entry, then this would be an opportunity to do so. One note that it is about planning and design for how coordinated entry will happen, and so direct services are not a part of the SSOSEE under the DV bonus. So why is this important? As many of you know, HUD issued the coordinated entry notice that established additional requirements for COCs around the coordinated entry process, and that happened back in January 2017. So within the CE notice, HUD also establishes or provides specific guidance to COCs on the coordinated entry response and how it relates to DV and sexual assault survivors. And through the CE notice or the coordinated entry notice, COCs can create unique access points and assessment protocols for survivors. If doing so will remove population-specific barriers to accessing the coordinated entry process, and also account for the different needs, vulnerabilities, and risk factors in the assessment process and prioritization that are faced by survivors. So while the CE notice was released in January 2017, really this COCs had a year, which was this past January 2018, to establish or update their CE process or coordinated entry process to meet the new requirements. So what we know is that many communities are still trying to define or refine prioritizing DV survivors in coordinated entry, and whether to use an integrated coordinated entry process or a parallel one. So really this SSO coordinated entry component of the DV bonus is a good opportunity to do that. And a lot of communities are still trying to figure out, again, do we want to do an integrated coordinated entry process where victim service providers participate in the broader COC coordinated entry process, or based on need of our community and the survivors we're serving, is a parallel coordinated entry or a comparable process more appropriate for serving survivors? Again, this would be an opportunity for COCs to use this component of the DV project to, for planning and implementation, and to explore and develop a CE process or coordinated entry process that makes sense for survivors and their communities. So before we switch on, I just want to say two things to highlight. Is one, we really want to encourage communities to apply for the supportive service only coordinated entry component to better equip your COC to serve survivors. And if you have questions, we certainly want to direct you to being able to submit the questions now, but also to direct you to the HUD Exchange, where you can submit a question through their Ask a Question portal desk as well. The other thing I would like to highlight is the consortium has developed an FAQ on domestic violence and coordinated entry. And after I finish giving my presentation today, I'll be happy to post that link into the chat box for you. So in addition to talking about the DV bonus, we also want to talk about where there are opportunities in the NOFA for COCs to prioritize domestic violence and serving survivors. And through the COC NOFA application scoring, the consolidated application will be assessed on a 200-point scale, and we don't want to get too much into the weeds on this, but we do want to touch briefly on rating factors such as coordination and engagement, project review, ranking and performance, and strategic planning, where DV and serving survivors is emphasized. So first up, under the rating factor of COC coordination and engagement, COCs can address the needs of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and human trafficking, serving survivors here. So it's about coordination and engagement. And in this section, HUD will award up to 48 points. So if a COC is addressing the needs of survivors, that can help maximize the scoring for the COC NOFA application. So it is coordinating with victim service providers and operators of coordinated entry to address the unique barriers for housing and services that prioritize safety. And through this, the COC must identify the current efforts to increase access to safe housing and services while adopting a victim service practice that maximizes client choice while also maintaining safety and confidentiality. And often when we talk about coordination and engagement in the past, it was simply kind of a rote checklist of, yes, DV is participating on this community, on this work group, or they're attending this meeting. But HUD has gone further to define what coordination and engagement looks like, and we've given you some specific examples on the slide, and you can also find out more in the NOFA, specifically on page 2. But victim service providers, coordination and engagement includes victim service providers being voting members of the COC, which Brittany discussed at the top of the hour. Also, how is annual training and ongoing training being provided to COC providers and operators of the coordinated entry process that's addressing best practices in serving survivors? And is the COC using de-identified aggregate data from comparable databases as appropriate? and to assess the specialized needs related to domestic violence and homelessness. And finally, safety planning and confidentiality protocols should be included in coordinated entry. So if COCs are able to address this within the NOFA, it's going to help in the scoring process while also prioritizing serving survivors. Other areas in the NOFA for prioritization of survivors, and again, just to briefly touch on it, is severity of needs and performance. How are COCs considered the severity of needs and vulnerabilities experienced by program participants? So that would include survivors in this category. So it would be great for DV programs to be reaching out with the COCs to figure out how they are addressing this in the application and showing where they are not only serving, but ensuring that victim service providers are informing the process for how that happens. The other two areas in the NOFA where there's an opportunity to prioritize survivors is ending homelessness among households with children. And again, you can find more information on the NOFA on page 66, but it is prioritizing households with children based on needs, and this does include having a history or vulnerability to victimization, whether it's DV, sexual assault, or childhood abuse. And then the other area is ending youth homelessness. Again, prioritizing unaccompanied youth based on needs. And this includes factors such as a history or a vulnerability to victimization. So again, I just want to emphasize, I know we went over this really quickly, but we did want to be sure that we're not solely focusing on the DV bonus, which is very important and we're extremely excited about, of course, but to also highlight where there's other areas in the NOFA competition to prioritize serving survivors. If you have questions, again, please contact your COC. I know we've posted a couple of links in the chat box on how you can find out the local contact information for your COC. If you have questions, you can certainly reach out to us via the Safe Housing Partnership website. We also encourage you to submit and ask a question through the HUD Exchange. And if there's anything else additionally that we can help you with, I know Debbie talked about this already, but the consortium TA team is available to answer questions and to provide technical assistance around any of these coordination, coordinated entry, making sure we're doing trauma-informed care, all of those great things at the intersection of DV and homelessness, so you can contact us through the Safe Housing Partnership website. And having said that, I am now going to hand the presentation back over to Debbie. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Christy. Yeah, I wanted to highlight the fun part of once you get the HUD NOFA funding, once you receive the award, then there's the rollout and there's outcome-related data that you need to be tracking and making sure that you're reporting to your COC, and then your COC rolls that up and reports that to HUD annually with the annual progress report. So I've seen a lot of discussion in the chat box about comparable databases and what that looks like. So first of all, I want to give you all a broad overview of why is data important and why are your COCs collecting this data. So basically, the work that's happening with the continuums of care and addressing and ending homelessness in your communities, they want to be able to have a snapshot and see from year to year the system performance, how your system is doing to end or prevent homelessness from happening in your community. So you have a system performance, like to see how the system works overall. And then you also have your project level performance if you're receiving this funding, like what are the outcomes for the individual survivors or participants in your programs that are receiving this funding, like how are they doing, and how is their the stability around their housing and achieving stability and ending their homelessness. So working with your COC and getting HUD NOFA funding, you are creating a systemic response to homelessness, and COCs are using the system performance measures such as the length of time homelessness, returns of rate to homelessness, and rates of exits to permanent housing to determine how they are serving people experiencing homelessness in their community. And then that also affects the scoring and rating and ranking kind of things when you're applying for HUD NOFA funds. So you all know these are the system performance measurements that your continuum of care will be looking for. you receive these funds, length of time homelessness, successful permanent housing placements, and no return to homelessness, the number, and reducing the number of homeless individuals and families. So looking at job and income growth, reduction in the number of the first-time homelessness, people experiencing homelessness in your community, returns to homelessness around prevention, and then successful placements from street outreach or retention into permanent housing. And then here's where the these outcome system performance measures play out in the HUD NOFA process. So when you're hearing from your COC around why data is important and why checking this information, it goes into the competition in terms of applying and being competitive. This is a national competition, and your COCs are competing nationally for these funds. So this information is reported in the annual progress report and via the HUD Exchange, and then they compare from year to year what the data looks like across the whole system. And then, so folks know around comparable databases, there's a lot of confusion in the field, and this is often a point of tension in the field, is the domestic and sexual violence field. We are bound by confidentiality with our VAWA and FIPSA regulations. Our goal is to protect client information and to ensure that if someone comes into our shelter or housing programs that people do not have access to that information or couldn't be subpoenaed. So it's, philosophically, the HMIS system, the Homeless Management Information System, is much more of an open system about sharing and being able to see where people are moving through the system and being able to see folks' data, whereas the domestic violence field, we are trying to protect confidentiality and are required, if you receive VAWA or funding, to protect that client information. So the solution that we have for that in the field is victim service providers are to use a comparable database, and it's a database that has zero knowledge encryption, and that it does fulfill the SAGE HUD reporting requirements for the annual progress reports. And if you are currently using a database or considering a database, if you receive these funds, we highly encourage you to reach out to the DV Housing Technical Assistance Consortium, myself, and NNEDV Safety Net team. We do a lot of work with communities and states on going through the process of picking out a comparable database, because it can be a spendy endeavor, and we want to make sure that those database vendors are in compliance and are on the HUD monthly vendor calls and are up to date with what the HUD data elements are. So how it works is we have a comparable database, and the information and the data is owned by the agency within the agency, and that agency enters the client information into their database, and they own that information, and they send that aggregate data to their HMIS lead, and they include it in their APR reporting to SAGE. And then there is some research, and not research, I wouldn't go that far. So there is some up-to-date policy information, and we just published a paper on HMIS and comparable databases. We also did a paper on coordinated entry and confidentiality in practice, because we see a lot of, we have a lot of questions in the field of, like, how do we do coordinated entry, and how do we ensure people have access to housing resources if we can't enter their data into HMIS, where now a lot of the coordinated entry system is coordinated, and how people are have on a list or like waiting list to have access for housing resources. So I highly encourage you to look at that, and then I could go on and on about comparable databases, but on the Safe Housing Partnership website, we just did a comparable database webinar series with the Texas Council on Family Violence and the Iowa Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the Safety Net team, and so there's 3 separate webinars that highlight comparable databases and what are best practices in the field currently. So I highly encourage you to check out those webinars, as comparable database and data collection is a whole big component to receiving HUD NOFA funding, and we want to make sure you know what you're getting into before you receive the funds. So just so you know, I just wanted to do another quick overview on some of the performance and strategic planning around continuums of care and their plan and progress towards ending homelessness. There's points in the current HUD NOFA around ending chronic homelessness and ending family and youth and veterans homelessness. So this is important for you all to be mindful of when you are working with your continuums of care, and just thinking about when you're working with your continuums of care, how can you support your COC and the program applications and work in community and in concert with your continuum of care to help reach these goals as a community, because I think we all, of course, want to end and prevent homelessness, and we have that common and shared goal in our prospective fields. And I think with that, we are at the wrap-up point of our slides, and we have a few minutes. We have about 15 minutes for Q&A. We've had a really great discussion in the chat box. People have been very, very chatty in the chat box, which is wonderful, but we'll open it up for questions on the chat box. If there's anything specifically you want to write in there, we can respond directly, and we'll open up the line for all the presenters to be able to respond. And then as you can see on the slide posted, we have the presenter's contact info, and we highly encourage you to reach out to us and connect with us if you have any specific questions. And I also want to just encourage you all, I know Britt mentioned at the beginning that many COCs are at the local level or asking programs to apply, and local agencies and government entities to apply currently. So please don't wait till the September deadline and think you're not applying directly to HUD, you're applying to your COC, and the COCs are in the process of that right now, of asking community orgs to apply. So please contact your COCs as soon as you get off the webinar if you're interested in this funding, and start working with them to partner and make it happen, and then you would turn an application into them, and then that would go on to HUD and the community application that is submitted in September. So at this point, I want to open the line to questions, and then we can respond if there's anything people want to know.
Debbie,
Hey, Debbie,
I'm sorry. I was just going to say I neglected to mention the webinar that that NNEDV is sponsoring tomorrow. I thought you might want to plug that.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for the reminder. So, yeah, this will definitely piggyback on Peg's presentation around the programmatic elements for the new DV bonus project funding. We have a webinar tomorrow that will be highlighting the work of the Kentucky Coalition Against Domestic Violence. They have applied as a statewide entity, as their state coalition, and are managing the funds and pass the funds through to their local programs in their state in Kentucky. So they have a really interesting model of how their funding is rolling out with their balance of statewide. And then we also have the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and they'll be highlighting their work, and their staff member, Maria Williams, who has a lot of experience doing DV housing, and in particular implemented a DV Rapid Rehousing Transitional Housing Joint Component Project. So that will be tomorrow, and that was on the same link as this link for this webinar. So we hope you can join us tomorrow, and I should know the exact time. So if anyone else knows it off the top of, it's 2:30 to 4 tomorrow. Do we have any questions in the chat box?
Hey, Debbie,
so this is Britt. I can answer this.
Sorry, go ahead, Britt.
You sure? Okay,
no,
so I can answer a couple of questions.
And then, I'm sorry, I know I'm talking all of you. I just wanted to say, I know we've got a lot going on with different webinars, and we will have the links on the Safe Housing Partnership, but I want to give a plug out for, we do have a YouTube channel, and all of our webinars are uploaded there under Safe Housing Partnership. So thanks, Britt. Sorry to overtalk you.
No, that is important information. I have to check out your YouTube channel. I wanted to answer a couple of questions about the bonus projects. I first wanted to clarify, we've gotten a couple of questions in the chat box clarifying around grading COC funding that's already COC renewal funding and DV bonus funding. So those projects, that can't be graded at the project level, but if you're a provider who's already getting COC funding and you want to develop a new project using bonus funds, you can do that. So just want to make sure that's clear to folks. I saw a question about whether a COC can limit bonus applications to organizations already participating in the COC, and wanted to clarify that COCs have to have open processes for new entities submitting applications. So you should be a part of that process. Recommend, working with a partnership lens on both ends of that, coming in with some of those opportunities we outlined earlier that go in both directions, but you should absolutely be able to submit new applications and join the process. Trying to check out if there are any other questions about the DV bonus projects. Oh yes, Katie's question about will this funding be available next year and what is the grant year? The grant year for bonus projects serving survivors of domestic violence is 1 year, and those projects will be eligible for renewal funding next year. Since this is kind of allocated and designated by Congress, this up to $50 million for these projects, we can't say what that may look like next year because that's really, really up to them. But if you have a project that's funded this year using those bonus funds, you'll be able to come in through renewal funding next year, which is great for the sustainability of these projects.
And I can add to that, Britt, currently the money is currently in the Senate and House budget, but obviously they need to vote on it. But currently, as it stands, there's the $50 million has been included in both budgets, but it needs to be voted on. So we're hopeful that it'll be continuation funding for next year.
And I'll jump in here. Katie, I saw that you had a follow-up question about the 1 year of grant funding. It is 12 months of funding. So COC projects, you yourselves can determine your operating years after receiving the funding award. I think our panelists are scrolling the chat box right now for other questions.
If there's no other questions, I see there's still a lot of chatting happening, but I don't see any specific questions. Okay. Yeah, so you can visit the Safe Housing Partnerships website for all the resources, and for this webinar will be posted there today. And then also, Christy, thank you for the reminder that you can also go to the AAQ on the HUD Exchange to ask questions as well, and they are very responsive, usually within 24 hours. So if you're in the midst of an application process or pulling something together or have questions in your NOFA, about the NOFA, they're really wonderful about getting back quickly. And we're also available, the Housing Consortium, we're able to help you think through any sort of elements of your application as well, and brainstorm about what works, and then obviously tomorrow with the webinar with Kentucky and Pennsylvania will give you more ideas of what your project could look like. I see the chat room quieting down a bit, so I think at this point we can wrap it up. We just have a few minutes left, but at this point I think all of you know how to reach us. Where's the webinar tomorrow? You would need to register, Barb, with the same link that you received the email for this webinar. There's a link for tomorrow's webinar, and I think we're going to wrap it up unless anybody has anything else. The other presenters, any last thoughts?
No, thank you all. This was really great. I'll drop a link into the chat box for the recording from our USICH webinar, but check out that YouTube channel too, because it sounds like safehousingpartnerships.org has a lot of great resources.
And thank you, Alicia, for being such a great host to all of us and putting the link for tomorrow's webinar. I really appreciate that. And so that does bring us to the end of our webinar. I want to thank you all for attending and all the great questions in the chat box. On behalf of the DV and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium partners, I'd like to thank you all who participated on this webinar, and I wish you so much luck during your HUD NOFA application process. We will send out the PowerPoint from today's webinar as well as the recording for you to reference and to share with your colleagues. You will also be able to find it on the Safe Housing Partnerships website, and you can find also the additional resources mentioned during our webinar about on the intersection of DV and housing and homelessness. And thank you all again for participating, and have a great day. Thanks.